All right. I have a special guest named Dr. Abraham Weizfeld.
Hi.
Um, for those of you who've watched Jason or the Bundes channel, should be familiar with him. He's done many things for Palestine throughout the years, and I don't have much to say at this time, except can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm I took the decision to help out in Palestine through direct action in 2003 when Rochelle Corey was killed by the bulldozer that was smashing over the houses of the residents in Rafah, Palestine, on the border with Egypt. And so, I thought it was rather outrageous in that they were getting away with murders of an international volunteer, from the United States, even. So, imagine what they were doing to the Palestinians as well, and it's only gotten worse since. So, I actually, my son was 15, so I figured he could, live on his own and with his mother's help. So I left, for Palestine, to go and help out. Because, I can testify, that what Israel is doing is not on behalf of the Jewish people, because I can speak on behalf of the Jewish Bund. I knew this, because I was raised by my mother, who was the Jewish Bundist from Warsaw. So, I had this power and knowledge of what it is, to be really Jewish, socialist revolutionary, and not a pretend socialist, and taking the land of Palestinians to set up a kibbutz, like Chomsky was doing for a while there, until he smartened up a bit. Chomsky, I wish I should speak with him again, because he's making a big mistake, on the Donbass, region, which he's totally ignoring. He's anti-NATO, okay, fine, but what about the liberation of these nationalities that were being invaded, foremost, by neo-Nazi brigades? No, that can't be left alone, treated as if it doesn't exist. He has to take a position on national identity, national self-determination. This he's not capable of doing because he's an anarchist. Anarchists don't recognize nations. Only the nation state they recognize, much like the liberals. I guess anarchism, can be thought of as, radical liberalism of its own sort. We're not really prepared, to make a revolution. We have to clear things up first. I hope it goes faster and sooner rather than later, because later may be too late. I've learned that from my own family's history. In Warsaw, it took 2 years for people to decide to revolt after they knew that they were being cattled into a death camp. Like all sorts of excuses can be used. And
there's some much we just don't know.
Atomization of the consciousness as well. And each person thinks that they're going to last another day, even while, their neighbor did not. It's that kind of mentality, this individualistic, like breakdown of the social consciousness, that is what, was the success of the Nazis. It's the collectivity that is the strongest thing.
If you don't mind me asking, for those viewers who aren't familiar with the holiday that they have every year in Palestine, what is the history behind it?
Which one?
Ramadan, I think that's the name.
Ramadan's happening in Palestine and the whole Arab and Muslim world right now. I'm fasting from Ramadan as well, in solidarity with my Palestinian friends. Yeah, Ramadan is international. I've been fasting for 3 weeks now. Yeah.
Well,
it's good for the mind and the body.
Oh. For my viewers who don't know, what is it exactly?
You fast all day long, and then you eat it at sundown. That's it. That's all. No breakfast, no lunch. And then you work anyway, of course. It's a discipline, and it's a restart, like a reset. It's a form of everything. And as well, I do my physiotherapy in the mornings, for sure. I did a video on that. So, you want to know about Palestine? Current events, like in high school or what?
Anything that you can provide from your experience.
Okay, look, like everybody knows that the West Bank is under military occupation. What does that mean? What does military occupation mean? Okay, this is what I think you should know. The details. It's the details that count. First of all, you have soldiers who can go anywhere, anytime, except for the municipalities called Sector A during the daytime. But at nighttime, they can go inside anytime and take anybody out and away for who knows how long without any charges, like without law, martial law, whatever the military orders, whatever military you receive from the military, you have to obey. Otherwise, you're in infraction of the military, and you can be charged with that infraction, even though you weren't charged with anything in the first place. You get it? That's martial law. Now, even one person that I knew from France who overstayed her visa of 3 months, for 3 years, okay, and boasted about it, they came and got her, broke down the door to her apartment, took her out. She was gone, like the next morning, deported to France. All her friends, gone, just like that. I had to mail her clothes even, That's what military occupation is. And that was in downtown of Nablus, one of the biggest cities in the West Bank. Okay, that's one layer of repression. Next, if you go to a demonstration that's anywhere close to an Israeli, colony, well, there's going to be police too. Police from where? Police from Israel. Israel? But Israel is over there, on the other side of the green line, isn't it? No, these police from Israel come into occupied West Bank territory in order to administer the law of Israel on who? Palestinians first and foremost, and not the settlers. The settlers get away with murder. I've seen it happen. I even videotaped one of the settlers killing Palestinians who was just walking on the sidewalk in Hawara, the town just outside Nablus, where there's a military outpost that controls the whole transit point on the highway into the city of Nablus from the south. And then they close it, like whenever they want to, for whatever reason, just show their power in order to carry out checks to control, the flow of traffic and people. So, this is the definition of a ghetto. And of course, the workers come out early in the morning, like 5:30, to go to work in Israel. Yes, 160,000 a day, every day. And then they say that, they're trying to set up a wall of separation in order to prevent terrorism. There's 160,000 Palestinians if they wanted to. They could do anything they wanted to. They don't, because they don't want to, Until recently, there's been there's a new group, Islamic Jihad or something. So then that's, the police from Israel. Then there's another layer of repression too. The border police, the Green Berets they're called. Now, if there's anything happening anywhere near the border, like in the Jordan Valley, well, the border police show up. They're like, full action, SWAT teams type thing. And then they all, assume the right to detain you. I was detained, one time we were walking through the Jordan Valley. Not even a banner, one Palestinian flag. Just to show, that this valley belonged to the Palestinians. And in fact, it had not been annexed by Israel because, Netanyahu couldn't get away with it under international pressures and under the pressures of the Arab allies that he got, to get recognition from. One of their, secret conditions was that he wouldn't formally annex, the West Bank territories that he was planning to do, like the Jordan Valley. So we walked down the Jordan Valley, walking down closer and closer to this colony, this huge colony, Mel Sharim or something, like close to the Jordanian border, right there, and we're getting closer and closer, all of a sudden, it happened to coincide with this military maneuver day. And so there was these, groups of military units, armored units, like all along the highway, going overland and everything like that, and so we come down to the highway right next to the settlement, the Israeli Zionist settlement. And we were about to go onto the highway and they freak out, all of a sudden, there's 4 Jeeps, that pulled in front of us. Okay. They say, go back where you come from, just, blocking access to the highway so that we wouldn't get any closer, to the colony over there on the other side of the highway, where we could see and they could see us, and that sort of thing. And so, we wouldn't move. They didn't move, so I'm feeling all of this, from behind in the bushes behind there, because I had nearly been arrested the day before, and another action gets complicated. So, people sort of, wouldn't leave, so then they started to use tear gas, and so people, sort of pulled back, but they wouldn't leave, so finally the military gave up, said, okay, you can, get your cars to come over here to this side of the highway, and you have to leave right away. So we said, okay, we'll leave. That was enough gas. Even the soldiers were getting gassed. I had a video of that, but they stole it. Anyway, so we're driving away, and this Jeep is following us down the highway. So the driver, he says, oh, look, there's the ambulance. Let's stop and talk to the doctor. Because, one of the passengers in the back, was feeling ill. And so we wanted her to be checked out by the doctor because of the gas, probably. So, got out. She goes to the doctor. Jeep stops. Pulls up behind us. They come over and they say, why did you stop? And the driver is still sitting in the vehicle. So he says, because we had to talk to the doctor. And I confirm this. And they say to the driver, come out, get out. Okay, that's trouble. So then they said to him, you shouldn't have stopped. You're under arrest. So he said, for what? For stopping. So then, they said, they looked at us and said, who's going to drive us? So then they said, okay, everybody get out. We're going to arrest you all. So, we all, they said, first they said, go sit there, on the guardrail for a while, an hour later. They said, okay, you're detained. I don't know if they said arrested, they said just detained. That was enough, you don't have to be arrested for anything, detained, just because they want to. Or, well, actually, the guy who tried to arrest me the day before, he showed up and he started screaming at them in Hebrew. And I think he was telling them, get this guy here. So they got all of us, and there was 8 of us. There was, 5 Palestinians, 2 women from Europe, from Spain and France, and me from Palestine. I was living in Nablus, but from Canada. Okay, so what are they going to do with us? They, so this was the big thing. They didn't know what to do, so they just took us into a military base, put us into a detention hall, and kept us, tied up. Of course, we were blindfolded, but we were tie-dyed, plastic tie-wrap ties around our hands, without any food, until about midnight. And then finally, some breads and cheese was made available. And, there's a whole story that goes through this. It's incredible. I wrote it all down. It's like a scenario for, a piece of theater. And then finally we are allowed to, leave. They took us to the highway, back to the highway, and they put us off on the shoulder of the highway, just dropped us off on the side of the highway, outside of the municipality. After 26 hours, when the police finally got to speak to us, and they found no reason to charge us with anything. And so we got released. And that was it. That was sort of a normal day in Palestine. You want to come? We're going to set up a guest house for international volunteers. And everybody come out and do some solidarity work with us indirect. It helps a great deal, with international volunteers, especially with somebody like me, who talks in Yiddish and tells them off. They can't start shooting with live bullets into the, Palestinian demonstration like they do in Gaza. Or one time they even, increased the number of dead, shot down and killed, 62 in one day. Couldn't believe that. I was in Palestine at the time. It was like shock. That's what they wanted to do. But we don't let them get away with that. So you're all invited to come and volunteer.
I have almost no words. Like, I shouldn't say this, but I sometimes feel desensitized because I see so much brutality against Palestinian men, women, and children.
Yeah, daily. Yeah. It can get worse like that sometimes in the United States, but not all the time. In Palestine, it's all the time. And getting worse now. Even though the government has changed and Netanyahu isn't there anymore, now the Israeli protesters are doing nothing because Netanyahu's gone, so they're happy. They're so...
Well, I got a question regarding that. What did they have a problem with him? Was he not far enough?
No, that was the opposition. The opposition is very strong in Israel. The Israeli, Jewish civil society is split about 50-50. And it depends on what's happening, where it goes. It's really sort of, and it could continue to degenerate into civil war. Sometimes the rightists, talk about, a civil war on public radio talk shows, that you hear on a taxi, where they talk about, having a civil war to kill off all the Democrats and leftists. Yeah. Leftists.
It's even more extreme in Israel.
Yeah, but, there's a lot of leftists, they can't get away with it. And the leftists, I think would be supported by the Palestinians, so, they can't get away with it. No way. So they're, stalemate, so it keeps on going, stalemate. For how long? Since 1993, the Oslo Accords. And, the big mistake was that, Arafat went for recognition of Israel without getting mutual recognition in return. Hamas now is calling for mutual recognition, reciprocal recognition, so that if, Israel wants to be recognized as a state, then Israel has to recognize Palestine as a state too. Otherwise, what's the point?
So, I was about to ask you about Hamas. What's your stance about Hamas?
Hamas has grown up. They quit the Muslim Brotherhood, became independent as a national, entity and not as a part of a branch of a subordinate to, a theocratic leadership. They learned, how to think for themselves. The charter of 1988 was dropped. They developed a new charter. I think it was 2017 that it was published. And they went into an op-ed published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, which I have yet to find, in their research mortar, for calling for reciprocal recognition with Israel. And in the new charter, they drop all the old anti-Semitic stuff, no more protocols of the elders of Zionism, Jewish conspiracy, imperialism bullshit. And they become, refined, and they understand, what Zionism is and what the Zionists are. And they oppose, Zionism as an ideology and as a state ideology, as a state ideology that imposes itself on other territories as well as its own territory, in addition to being objectionable in the first place. So Hamas is saying all this now. The new charter is available on the net, no problem. And I, tell this, to people on forums like, the Confederation of Israeli and Palestinian, like Peace or whatever, and they don't know. so few people know. This is all suppressed. It just is not known. And forget about the corporate media. They're not going to tell you for sure. They are not going to interview Hamas. So, I'm rather sympathetic to Hamas. No problem. I even represent Hamas in the debates that we have in the Constituent Assembly that we're putting together, for Confederation of Israel and Palestine, or Israeli and Palestinians is even better. Yeah, I have no big problem with Hamas. I spoke with Hamas when I was in Nablus during the prisoners' general hunger strike, and we were at a prisoners' solidarity tent in downtown Nablus, and I was there every day. And then this guy calls me over, or I thought, he was calling me to sit in the shade, because, you have to sit underneath the shade of a net, strung between the buildings. Otherwise, the sun will roast you to death. So I moved into the shade, He said, no, come over here, talk with me, I want to talk with you, But he only, knew how to talk in Arabic, pretty well. So a friend, from a leftist, came over and translated. And turns out that this guy, like it was some local, like Hamas thinker, or representative, or deputy, or something like that. And we spoke with him at length, and he understood, what I was actually talking about. He listened, because like I was experienced, I was in Palestine. I was working with the Palestinians. I was risking myself together with the Palestinians, and so he believed, what I was saying to him about being a second-generation Holocaust survivor whose family had fought against fascism, and which I continue to do against the fascists, or Zionists in Palestine as well. And so he accepted this as legitimate. He understood, he understood what a Jewish people is, but not a Jewish state. That Jewish people is one thing, but a Jewish state is not. And that as a Jewish state is objectionable. It was originally objectionable even to the prophet Samuel, in which citations, can very well be sought, to carry this, essence of Judaism. What is it all about? It's a political sense of a nation which is a people, diverse, and now we have various Jewish nations, amongst the Jewish people internationally. And Israel claims to speak on behalf of the Jewish people. No way, Only a minority of the Jewish people live in Israel. Majority of the Jewish people live actually in the United States of America. So, does the United States of America speak for the Jewish people? No. So, Israel doesn't speak for the Jewish people either. What it speaks for is, the Protestant, crusade into occupying Jerusalem once again, as it was done in 1917 by General Allenby, who said, that this was the last crusade. He promised that it was going to last forever. So I guess, Zionists are allies of the Crusaders. I guess you would call that mercenaries. At 3.8 billion plus benefits, yeah, I think that you can call that a mercenary state.
Well, I do got a question, though, regarding about Zionism. What is it exactly from the perspective of a Jew? Because those who don't know what Zionism is, they equate Zionism with Judaism. Yet majority of Zionists are not Jews.
Yeah, it's an ideology, first of all, and it came about not by the Jewish people. It was first written about like in 1836 by some guy or other, whose name I deliberately forgot, and it was a Christian Zionist, evangelical. And that came from the period in European history called the Reformation. What was that? When all these states, were fighting for their national independence, and they broke off in terms of religion as well. And they formed their own religion, like Calvinism in Germany, in Holland, Lutheranism in Germany, Anglicanism in England, and this provided the justification for the sanctification of the head of state to the king, anointed by the church in order to be like a demigod or something like that, like whatever. So this is what the Zionists are doing, only they're late, because they were so repressed. So they said, like if the nation states of Europe don't accept us, because they're Christian nation states, with even crosses on their flags and stuff like that. Okay, then they figured the only thing to do is, to adopt the same ideology, assimilate, to that mentality, and go and make, a Zionist nation state to represent, the Jewish national bourgeoisie, basically, so they could have security and they wouldn't be, looted out, like they were in Germany once again, because, the Jewish bourgeoisie or the Jewish, feudal aristocracy was always, looted, by one monarchical administration after another when they just wanted to. So, like if you have a nation state, with an army, presumably this cannot be done, and that's all the national bourgeoisie cares about. That's what Zionism is.
Well, another question regarding Zionism. No, I've heard this, and I can't confirm this. Is it true Zionists assisted the Nazis during the Holocaust?
Well, not all the Zionists, not the membership of the Zionists. They didn't even know what their leadership was doing. It would be incorrect to say that Zionists were helping the Nazis. Like Livingston, when he said that, in the English, when he was in the political scene there as mayor or whatever, he made a mistake, a mistake of emphasis. And he never acknowledged it, because he didn't understand it, really. He was repeating a cliche that was handed, from one to another, in the Solidarity movement as a justification for opposing Zionism, but without really knowing why. Now, Zionism wanted to make an accommodation with fascism because they didn't think that, the democracies were going to win. They thought that fascism was going to win the war. That's why, Chamberlain also made a deal with the fascists because he thought the fascists were going to win the war in Europe because they weren't strong enough to stop them. And that's why Stalin made a deal with the Nazis as well, because he thought that the Nazis were going to win. So he wanted them to go and take out France and England rather than Russia. But they were all wrong. The Zionists too were wrong, because the Nazis were defeated. And the first battle in that defeat of the Nazis was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. Until then, the Nazis were winning. So you see, direct action works. Now, what to do about Zionism? The Bund has to be rebuilt, because it was the only alternative. It was the, adopted position of the Jewish, East Europeans, under the most repressive regimes, that they needed, a socialist revolution, but an autonomous, Jewish national identity as well, in order to continue living in that environment and in the world, because if you can't defeat fascism in your own country, how are you going to defeat it in the world? Eventually it's going to come and seek you out. That's the nature of fascism. It doesn't stop. So, you have to defeat it, where it's growing, in the bud. And that's what, the Red Army did. That's what I think the Red Army is doing in the Donetsk region of the Ukraine now as well. It's too bad, this region, could have been both federated with both Ukraine and Russia, both at the same time. Why not? I think Ukraine sort of really blew it. Nationalism is such a dead end. Same thing happened to Poland. When the treaty was made, between the Soviet Union, so-called at the time, even though there were no more Soviets after 1926, the Soviet Union made a treaty with the Nazis, to divide up Poland. Isn't that incredible? The Soviet Union was going to get eastern half of Poland, and the Nazis were going to get the western half of Poland, and to heck with the Jews who live there. That's what it was all about. Well, incredible. Failure of vision, failure of imagination, failure of any sort of, socialist thought, giving up on socialism, conceding to Nazism, fascism. That's what that was all about. When in fact the socialist revolution was feasible. It was just that there was a certain level of incompetence, failure of imagination, mistaken positions on the national question Why is it a question? A good question. Huh. Jewish Bund never accepted that question. Marxism did, and that's why they called it the Jewish question. Never disavowed by Marx. No, intolerable. Yeah, so that has to all get cleared up, and then we can make the revolution. Okay?
Well, I think that the issues need to be dealt with during the revolution, not after.
Oh, this is called the pre-revolutionary condition. Yes, when this great debate breaks out. Yeah, okay. Let's call it a pre-revolutionary period that we're in now. And the revolution breaks out into direct action from time to time and is never fully repressed. Yeah. Prolonged periods. Very interesting. And now the crises are going to come through, rolling crises, one after the other, one on top of the other. The economies are, like, they haven't paid in the rubles yet, so like Europe is going to be not only without, gasoline, but electricity as well, powered by oil and gas. The economies will crash. So I don't know, what are they banking on? Like, are they banking on a turn to the right, and promoting the Nazis to take over, and impose such a repression that there are no consequences, no revolution? Oh yeah, it seems like that's likely to be happening. Judging from what's happened in France, look at that. Mélenchon, United Front candidate of the left, even though I have disagreements with him, I would support him anyway, just like I supported, Bernie Sanders, like it's the only hope of the left, independent of bourgeois, politics and parties. So he lost, by like, 4 percentage points, from being in the finals? Okay, now who took those 4 percentage points away from Mélenchon, who calls themselves leftists? Okay, let's start with, first on the list, the great, Communist Party of France. Yay! 2.3% it got in the polls. So it alone, took away, the opportunity for Mélenchon to defeat, the bourgeois candidate and become president of France, and unleash a revolution. Former Trotskyist even, whatever that's worth nowadays. Who else? Socialist Party. What do they got? What do they get? 3% of the vote. So they defeated, Mélenchon as well. And then the Green Party, 4.3%. Wow, glory be, to the Green Party, 4.3%. They blew it too. All 3 of them are good for nothing. They destroyed, this initiative. These things are decisive turning points in history. This could be a turning point towards, fascism in Europe. And that would provoke the United States into a war with China. Yeah, it could happen. But of course, once the anti-war movement is mobilized for real, not this phony peace movement, that they have going in solidarity with Ukraine. No. It could be very bad. But it could be a breakthrough too.
Well, what's your position on the Ukraine situation compared to Palestine? Because I've heard those comparisons.
Well, Ukraine is like Israel, is another Israel in Europe. It's just, a state that claims sovereignty for itself in alliance with the West into the East and expanding furthermore into the East, into the Donbass region and claiming it for its own territory, even though it wasn't always, and was, handed over to the Ukraine for military strategic purposes by the decision of Lenin in order to foster Ukrainian unity in opposition to the Nazi invasion. It's something that should be studied and not imposed. and the referendum was taking place, they got more than 90% in favor of autonomy. Like from what I see in the interviews, they don't trust the Western Ukrainian people anymore, to safeguard them. So they're probably going to go for independence or federation as an autonomous region with Russia, probably. So it's interesting, what Russia's setting up. They call itself a federation. I wonder if it really is. I'd like to see its constitution. Something interesting to study, how they're doing that. Because it's the only sort of, country in the world, that it combines both the Orient and the Occident. It's both Europe and Asia. It's called Eurasia. It's a Eurasian formation, together with other formations in the region that are allies and in the sort of, sphere of influence, etc. And now it seems to be merging with China. Unlimited, China said. Unlimited convergence, with Russia. I think that scared the United States there. Now they got sort of, more polite with China. And then India, they tried to sort of, talk it out with India. Doesn't work anymore. India is remaining independent. Even though it's a right-wing regime, no hope for the USA in India. So there's, supporting Russia on the sanctions bit. I mean, that's where they get all their energy from. So, no way can they turn down Russia in favor of the United States. They don't need the United States. They have their own manufacturing sector, which is in competition with the United States and China. My. But the pandemic, continues on, and people didn't believe it's going to continue on like this. And that's because, what they have provided as a solution is not a complete solution. It's only a partial remedy in order to keep the hospitals from filling up. Because, the vaccine that they have provided is not an antiviral vaccine. It is a vaccine inhibitor, because it stops the vaccine from sinking roots into this human cell. That's all. But the virus itself is still there. It still evolves and becomes something that can defeat the vaccine in the first place. What is required is an antiviral vaccine, which is made from the antibodies created by the human immune system against the viral infection in the first place, which can then be harvested, cloned, and made into a pill called a monoclonal antibody viral vaccine. Okay? Why don't they make it? Because it's not patented. No pharmaceutical company is going to make billions off of that. It's just a generic drug. Anybody can make it. But there is no, laboratories, of that stature that can make it, anymore, that are in the public sector that would take it on, under urgent conditions that we're now under. So under and under we go. So, do they ever mention how many people have died in the world up to now? I've heard the figure of 20 million. 20 million. Is that a war or not? That, is that important as a war? Yeah. So where does the money go for? Ukraine. How much is it now? 4.5 billion? Yeah. And how much money do they give to Palestine under the, U.S. sponsorship of the Palestinian Authority? Like about 135 million a year. And that, a lot of that is skimmed off, by high salaries that are sent by the Palestinian population in the administration that calls itself the Palestinian Authority. I'm talking a lot, huh?
I got a question. What is the Palestinian Authority?
I've been there. I know some people there. I know people as well in the international network, which is the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. In fact, I worked for the PLO in 1982 to 1985 in Ottawa at the Palestine Embassy that is run by the Fatah Party, which has the prerogative of taking care of international diplomacy on behalf of all of the Palestinians and is acknowledged as such by Hamas. Now, the Palestinian Authority was set up under the 1993 Oslo Agreement to administer the upcoming Palestine state, only was never recognized, and the military of Israel never withdrew from the territories designated at that time. So the Palestinian Authority, get financed, to set up a special police called the Preventive Security Police. Okay, I admit it. This layer of repression I didn't mention before, because this layer of repression is focused only on Palestinians. So when, the Zionists, monitor some Palestinians and think that they're going to become a danger to the state of Israel, then their name is reported to the Palestinians, and they're asking the Palestinians to cooperate and restrain these individuals for their own good in a Palestinian prison. And that's what they do. They drive up in this, beige, sandstone, Jeep, and they arrest Palestinians and take them away to a Palestinian prison and hold them there. They even did that to the leader of the left-wing Palestinian Party. And then he was taken, by the Israel military and put into an Israel prison later on. And he's still there after some decades. So,
can you explain to the audience who doesn't know BDS?
Yeah, BDS is the origins of BDS. Okay, it was before it became a Palestinian campaign of all of Palestinian civil society organizations. So a United Front, a federation of all the Palestinian, organizations and ONGs and social service organizations, got together and put up this, campaign, an appeal for international solidarity. To do what? To help them by putting pressure on Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians for the real. So they said, boycott Israel products so that the economy, will, lose some revenue, so that, then, the Israelis, will think about what the interests of the Palestinians should be as well as their own. And disinvestment, look for, for investment funds of educational institutions, universities, etc., that have invested in stocks that are, Israel corporations, or mutual funds that invest in Israel corporations, and disinvestment, for any investments that are partners, in Israel corporations to disinvest, and sell their investments and that sort of thing. Okay, this is an economic strategy, whereas before, appealing on a moralistic basis didn't seem to be working. So BDS, became an international campaign, and then the Zionists, freaked out because it wasn't doing any real damage to the economy, but it was like a public relations campaign. So a lot of people heard about this. So the Zionists freaked out and they wanted to stop it, but by trying to stop it, they made it more famous. So everybody knows about it now. So that's what it's all about. But originally it was, a campaign by Dr. Uri Davis, who's a Jewish Palestinian living in Ramallah, who said, look at this, the Zionists come around into the Jewish community and they, and they ask for donations to the Jewish National Fund, from children, with their coins into a blue box until they grow up, and they tax them. It's like taxation without representation, because Jewish Americans, etc., do not get a vote in Israeli elections, but they're taxed anyway, So he said, let's boycott the Jewish National Fund so that they don't have the funds, to do the settlement work, and because they were setting up a Canada Park, partially on the lands, occupied in the '67 war. And Canadians didn't even know this, but they were donating money to it anyway, just like my cousin, Helen. She didn't even know she was donating this. She thought it was all on, pre-'67 territory. They just lied to her. So, we set up this boycott and started to go, and then developed into a general boycott of all of Israel products, including its propaganda. So that's what BDS is all about.
Another question is what's up with the loyalty pledges?
In the United States, loyalty pledges, you mean?
Worldwide. I mean, you can use the United States as an example. Because despite Israel being on the other side of the globe, in some states, you're required to do a loyalty oath. In some institutions, otherwise, you cannot either have a job or you can get fired.
Yeah, I heard about such a case. Yeah, and she contested it as well. Yeah, that you had to disown BDS or you had to pledge loyalty to the state of Israel in order to get a job in the United States of America or something like that. Yes, I've heard of this. Incredible, just incredible. Wow. Well, yeah, I got boycotted. Like I used to, like I was a course director. I was teaching a course at the university called York University in Toronto on the Glendon campus. And I taught there for 3 years. And then when I went to Ottawa to work at the Palestine Embassy because Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. And after that, I tried to get a job again, both in Ontario, in English Canada, and in French Canada, and I couldn't get any job after that, because I was not trusted to be able to, support, Israel. And speaking as a Jewish person, as a Jewish academic, that's too much for them to have tolerated, because they knew that they would have been attacked by the Zionists and accused me of being an anti-Semite, just because I was against Israel, and that the institution was anti-Semitic for having, allowed me to teach there. So the universities wouldn't allow me to teach, even though I got my doctorate finally. In fact, that's what, the Zionist pressure was all about, in delaying my doctorate, because they didn't want, a doctorate that was anti-Zionist to be legitimatized, because otherwise they couldn't claim that anti-Zionism was necessarily anti-Semitic, because as a Jewish Bundist, it was not. Of course, like anti-Semitism, tried to use anti-Zionism sometimes, but not, within a Jewish Bundist framework, because we recognize the identity of the Jewish people and the right of self-determination for the Jewish people, but not by denying the very same right of self-determination for another nation. That's the trouble with Zionism, because it's not a nation without a people for a people without a land. It's just not true. And when the young Jewish students come to university and find out that they've been lied to all their lives, then they become anti-Zionists. And they're not afraid, because they've been taught not to be afraid. In the Jewish political culture, that's it, you have a right to say it. And I do. So, and I have a Jewish education as well. So, I'm usually, all the critics that I get, are usually ignorant of what it is to be Jewish, and they've just been educated into a Zionist history. Whereas, I've gone through, when I was Orthodox, raised Orthodox by Jewish refugee parents, from Poland. Of course, I went through an Orthodox education, 7 years, evening school after Protestant day school. Did the bar mitzvah well, and the Haftorah in Aramaic. Did the whole trip. So I know, what's in the book and what's not. And what the Zionists say is in the book is not. I can go into an elaboration about that another time. There's a lot of stuff, the Zionists lie about. They create myths. Then they have whole school called the National School, centered in London, at the London School of Economics. And they hold conferences every year in which they give credence to what they call nation building. And then you're supposed to be able to use myths and lies in order to do so, because it's all justified, by the final result, which is to give the nation some form of independence, which is equated with security and culture, and everything is defined as the state after a while, and is actually the seed of Nazism, to be found in the 1648 Westphalia Agreement for the unification of Germany as a nation state. And they could never accommodate, the nationalities, like Jewish Germans and Roma Germans, Sinti. They could never understand that. You had to be a Christian in order to be a German, even though, Christianity didn't come from Germany, and Germans weren't always Christians. It didn't matter, this is all the part of the nation building, myth building, in order to create a state with the theocratic, rationale for the legal authority, being the Kaiser. Yes, Kaiser Hindenburg, who appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. He wasn't elected. appointed him, just chose him just like that. The aristocracy gave in to the Nazis in order to save themselves, from all the communists and socialists and anarchists and Spartacists and Bundes. Yeah, that's the way it is. That's the way it was. But the Bund, lost most of its membership there. So, the Zionists pretend that, Bundism is no longer important because, it doesn't have all this membership. But that's irrelevant. In fact, that would provide, it with more relevance rather than less relevance in order to preserve the thought, that was actually trying to defeat the fascism that the Nazi, while the Nazis were making, deals, with the Zionist leadership. And their deals were so pathetic, too. They only saved, like 60,000 Jewish Germans. Of course, they were Zionists, or bourgeois. And only 1,883, I think, Hungarian Jewish, Zionists and bourgeois. And for that, they gave up the boycott of Nazi Germany. And they broke, solidarity with the Jewish people against, Nazism. And that's what's called Zionism.
The thing that never made sense to me is Zionists are claimed to be against Nazism, yet they support Nazis everywhere.
Yeah. Because, see, Zionism claims that the state is more important than the people. The state is more important than the nation. That all they are doing is trying to preserve the state by any means necessary, even by sacrificing its own people, and sacrificing up to 3 years, of a young men's lives and 2 years of young women's lives, in compulsory military training, while they should be studying in university. So they get trained into obedience, and then when they finally do get into university, they've forgotten how to think. And the only thing they can do is, memorize some technical data and do a startup. It's pathetic. Israeli society is so proud of itself, but I find it, rather primitive, actually. Primitive in thought. But, what's also, disappointing is, the Orthodox yeshivas. There are some signs, that it's still alive, even though they get, so super funded these days, and they can study all their lives. But they don't use it, they're sort of dependent upon the subsidies to keep their families going, that they never sort of dare to, express anything, that displease, their donors. That's what Chabad is all about. So they get, these Jewish cultural centers all over the world, like in Asia even, incredible, funding that they get. But, it's pathetic when they come, to actually subordinate themselves, to the Zionist movement and ideology. Not all the time. About half of it, yes, half of it, no. Let's see what happens there. But then the Satmars, are anti-Zionists. The Turei Karta are anti-Zionist and activist as well. Great people. They're always there at every demonstration called by the Palestinians.
So what do you think of the future of Israel is going to be?
Well, that's what my book is about. While I was in Nablus, I wrote a book on, what the future of Israel and Palestine inevitably has to become. Otherwise, it would just break apart in a civil war. And if that were to be prevented or to be stopped eventually, you would have to resort, to the eventual conclusion, in any case, by logical deduction. And the logical deduction is that you have to have a federation of two nations, not a state, because a state is sovereign in and of itself and imposes its centralized authority over everybody within its domain. And but in a federation, you have national cultural autonomy, which is the Bundes principle. So you apply the Bundes principle to Israel and Palestine. So you have these two major nations there, each have national cultural authority, and they each elect their own governments. And each of their own people vote for their own governments. And if people are nationals of both nations, then they can vote in both governments, like no big deal. And then they have a federation, a council of federation, a confederation, at first of two, mutually recognized states. And eventually they integrate, the whole process so that people vote for their own government irrespective of where they're living in the first place. And that becomes a federation. And each federation, recognizes that each nation has the right to their own language, culture, religion, police, security, constitutional authority for themselves, and constitutional rights in the federal constitution, with tripartite commissions for the judiciary, and a similar principle, for setting up a security force, for the federation that would stop any internal conflicts or any external interventions into the country. So, it's all, worked out in a constitutional basis with provisions, that are provided for in the Partition Resolution of 1947 as well. Resolution 181. So it's legally documented as well. So it's a solid document. It's been translated into Arabic now, and is now being printed, in Jordan. And a second edition with additional annexes, of study and research, with additional commentary in the preface, extensive preface by myself, and introductions by two publishers that I know, is now being published as a second edition in English as well in the United States. So I'm coming out with a big offensive, because I'm taking on a big job here. There has to be sort of, a reckoning with Zionism, to let the Jewish people know, that they don't have to be suckers, for, the lies that they've been told, as propaganda by Zionism. And they don't have to be slaves from Israel and go and volunteer in the military to save, the Israelis from terrorism. Really. That's such a word. That reminds me, of what the Nazis were talking about. When they were talking about what? The terrorists who were fighting against their occupation in Poland, including, my mother's brother, who was called a terrorist by the Nazis because he was a partisan fighting against the Nazis in the forest of Russia when they invaded Russia. Before that, he organized an underground railway to get the women out of the Warsaw Ghetto so they could, repopulate the nation. This word terrorist, really. That's why I call NATO the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, because that's what they do. They're the ones who bring terrorism into other countries. They're the ones who invaded the Orient from the Occident as another crusade started in 1991 in Kuwait. And now they're occupying the oil fields in Syria, claiming they're coming there to help, the people out. Has Biden done anything to change that around? No way. Huh. Well, let's see what happens now. But still so difficult, especially with the climate. It's so serious, the climate. I've studied science. I know this climate, crisis is real and is developing. Because I used to be in the sciences before, I was compelled to go and study political science. And I used that methodology not only in political science, but in studying economy and the climate as well. And, there's big extremes happening at the same time, which means that there are going to be incredible clashes of energy and levels of cold and hot, in the atmosphere that create incredible storms that would otherwise not be happening. And it could be devastating, for coastal plains as well, especially when at the same time you have sea levels that are rising. So, New York, really, forget about thinking about anything else. But Palestine, is a key sort of, point, if Palestine can be resolved, then we get sort of a methodology by which to do so, for every other country in the world. like Tigray, is a federated, entity within Ethiopia. For mutually federated Burundi and Rwanda, for instance, to unite the various nationalities there. All this stuff could be done in a federation, but a nation state, a bourgeois nation state, it can't accomplish any of that because it doesn't recognize civil society as being independent, because only the state is independent and governs the civil society with some liberal accommodations, for freedom of speech, etc., freedom of association, freedom of assembly, unless the police decide otherwise, of course. And then, 10 years later, they say, oh, yes, they were wrong. Okay. I know there's a lot to talk about.
There's a lot, but I don't think we have 4 or 5 hours because there's so much.
We could go on for 4 or 5 hours, I don't know. But, after the operation, after I've recovered, okay?
Sure. Well, I got one last question, if you don't mind me asking. Oh, you make it shorter as long as you want. Okay. What advice do you have for activists who want to help the Palestinian cause?
The strongest thing you can do is to come to Palestine. I mean, it's difficult to do so, like for North America, because it's so expensive to travel and all that, But if any sort of, collective organization that is interested in doing solidarity work with Palestine can sponsor somebody to go to Palestine and to work, with us, for, let's say, a month or 2 or 3 or 3 months, is what you get as a visa. And then they would know what was going on there. And then they could come back and they could testify in public, as to what they saw there, what they experienced, what happened to them, what the Palestinians told them, what the Palestinians want, what is possible, what they've seen, of the Zionist settlers doing in the West Bank and all that sort of stuff. And everything that I've talked about. If they could testify to that effect, in public, well, then it's much more powerful. Then people will believe them. So I think that's what, people can do. And when I go there, I'm going to be setting up, a hostel, a guest house for people to come and live there, while we can work together and go out on demonstrations together to do, journalistic work, photojournalism, video work, video broadcasting, live streaming, everything. We'll do it, from demonstration, live coverage, conferences, everything. Forums, at the Palestinian Cultural Enlightenment Forum. And they have forums, a very intellectual society. Speakers, discussions, everything's free and open. We put subtitles on it, get translation going. And then set up, online forums with masses of people as well in constituent assemblies, in various localities to federate. We can build this, build underneath, the whole apparatus of the superstructure, that calls itself the state. And then we just, explode like a volcano and throw it all off. If they try to stop us, then we stop them. That's what it's all about. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was an honor having you on.
Thank you. Really.